Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at the Bulgarian unique unit, the Konnik. Obviously, the feature that makes them particularly unusual is that they're basically two units in one. First, it's a cavalry unit, but then when it's taken down, comes back for more as a weaker melee unit. The fact they're two different types of units in one makes them especially hard to counter, and allows them to give much better value than you might think at first glance. Let's check them out. Before we start, a quick fact I want to point out is they are technically two different units, with the standing up sequence being actually part of the first unit's death animation. The second unit is just spawned in at that location, which you can see from its line of sight. They also count as 2 kills for your opponent, I guess one for the horse and one for the rider. Only the first kill counts towards their score though, as the dismounted version technically has no cost. To get an idea of how good they are, let's check out their stats and find some familiar units for comparison. In Castle Age, I think the mounted version is pretty similar to the knight. On the one hand, they have 2 more attack, but at the same time give up 1 pierce armor. Considering they're 5 gold less, I think the Konnik has a slight edge there stats-wise, even before factoring in the dismounted version. The closest comparable for those, I think, is the long swordsman, though you can see it more heavily weights attack than defense. It's not as good as the long swordsman, strictly speaking, and I'll show you why in a second, but when you consider the fact it's basically a free unit, it's fair to say that overall you're getting a lot of value. Switching to the Imperial Age, the elite Konnik ends up being slightly better than a cavalier with 2 more attack, but definitely appears worse than the paladin with lower HP and 1 less pierce armor. The dismounted version is also improved by the elite upgrade, but lags behind the 2-handed swordsman again, with 1 more attack for 10 less HP. Like in Castle Age though, once you consider the total cost involved, it still looks like a great deal on a cost per unit basis. Of course, to get a complete picture of its cost, you also need to think about upgrades. Part of what pushes that cost up is they need both cavalry and infantry techs. The mounted version, for example, benefits from bloodlines, husbandry, cavalry blacksmith techs, and their unique tech stirrups. The dismounted version, on the other hand, has almost completely different upgrades, aside from attack. It needs infantry armor upgrades from the blacksmith, as well as squires and arson from the barracks. If you add the elite upgrade in there as well, altogether that ends up being nearly identical to getting fully upgraded paladins. One thing that does sort of help there is their team bonus for faster working blacksmiths, so at least it won't be quite as much of a logjam to get all 9 of those blacksmith techs. One of the upgrades for the Konnik is particularly easy to forget, but is incredibly important, and that's the unique tech stirrups. It says it increases their attack speed by 25%, but at the risk of beating a dead horse, I have to point out again it's actually 33% faster, the same as the Japanese infantry bonus. It's a really important upgrade, because remember all that stuff about comparing their attack to the knight line? Well, it turns out that before this upgrade, they attack quite a bit slower than knights and paladins, so their damage output isn't as great as it looks on paper. Without upgrades, despite 2 less attack, the knight is doing around 12% more damage over time before you get stirrups. After their unique tech, they attack basically at the same rate, so that higher attack on paper starts to actually show up in practice. Considering what a large difference it makes, I think stirrups should always be researched early on when making them, though at the same time that automatically adds 400 food and 200 gold to their cost when compared to just going with knights. The 400 food especially is a bit of a commitment in Castle Age, but remember it's giving you 33% faster attack, which is a massive increase. In case you're wondering, their dismounted version, as you might expect, is not affected by a tech called stirrups. They always attack at the same rate, which unfortunately is a bit slower than their militia line counterparts. The end result is basically identical damage output, despite having what appears to be 3 more attack than the swordsman line. Again, in the Imperial Age, the 2-handed swordsman may appear to have 1 less attack, but overall it has a higher damage output, on top of also having 10 more HP. Suffice it to say, the dismounted version is definitely a bit weaker than its comparable swordsman unit, but it's also free, so it's hard to complain. I think this is a good example of where the stats behind the scenes can be just as important as the stuff that's shown. In terms of other hidden stuff, the movement rate of the mounted Konnik is the same as the knight line, and the dismounted version is the same as the sword line, so nothing too crazy going on there. The training time is 19 seconds for the Konnik, which is on the quicker side of things. And the fact that they can be created at Krapos means they're also easier to mass than a lot of other unique units. Remember, the cost of a Krapos is the same as a single stone pile, so getting 4 or 5 of them up by Imperial Age is pretty reasonable on most maps. As a cavalry and infantry unit respectively, they also of course have the appropriate weaknesses to counters, and their only attack bonus is the dismounted version's +4 against buildings. So that's a general look at the unit, but I always find it's helpful to see how it matches up against more generic units to really put its long-term value into perspective. To me, the most obvious place to start is, again, with the Knight line. Starting with completely unupgraded units, the Konnik actually wins fairly easily, with about a third of its combined HP left. This is even without stirrups, but remember the Knight is also lacking a lot of things here too. If you were to throw completely unupgraded Konniks in against fully upgraded Knights, the Knights end up dominating. Considering Knights don't require a castle and have fewer upgrades, this says to me there definitely is a window of opportunity to go for Knights against Konniks early on. If we give both sides complete Castle Age upgrades though, the Konnik ends with around half of its total HP left. That's pretty insane value, trading better than 2-to-1 against Knights in terms of food and gold. For me, this all highlights the importance of pressuring a Bulgarian player early. If they are able to get up a castle for their unique tech, multiple Krapos, and their upgrades, it's hard to beat them long term in value. They're particularly strong anytime you're allowed to free boom instead of fighting early, like in a Black Forest or free-for-all game. For that reason, in all of the Castle Age tests that I'll be showing, I'm gonna assume they have all of their upgrades. And just keep in mind that the unit is nowhere near as good as I'm showing if you just throw it out there completely unupgraded. Switching to Imperial Age against the Knight line, they end up trading very effectively against Cavaliers, and even against Paladins, they end up being slightly cost effective, though I wouldn't say it's completely one-sided here. Switching to a couple of their counter units, looking in Castle Age against Pikes with a 50% numbers advantage, the Konnik actually holds up pretty well. It trades about equally with Pikes in terms of total resources, and again against Halberdiers in the Imperial Age, though of course remember it's a gold intensive unit, whereas Pikes are not. To put that into perspective, the Paladin in a similar matchup loses more than double the total resources to Halberdiers. The obvious difference here is that while the mounted Konnik takes bonus damage, the dismounted version doesn't, which automatically gives them some built-in resistance. Against Camels as well, when slightly outnumbered, the Konniks end up trading about equally. In fact, at this point they look like a pretty scary unit, since while Pikes or Camels alone are good at bringing down the mounted version, you really need a ranged support unit to take out the low HP infantry. Genoese crossbows seem like the best option to me with +7 attack against cavalry, but most civilizations will end up needing a blend of units to exploit the weaknesses of both. Against more generic units without anti-cavalry bonuses, they perform really well, again, as you probably expect by now. They're basically evenly matched when outnumbered 2-to-1 by champions, which I think says a lot about their population efficiency. That said, there are a few units that can hold up to them. Teutonic Knights and Elephants, for example, can do quite well, but considering the Konnik's mobility, these aren't fights that the Bulgarian player will actually have to take. With balanced resources, they also lose to Samurai, which do 12 bonus damage against both the mounted and dismounted version. In fact, as far as I know, they're the only unit that has bonus damage against both. But while they generally outperform the Knight line against melee units, against ranged units, it's not as clear-cut. For example, against crossbows, they both take the same number of shots, and this is including the dismounted version, which is less effective against them. Likewise, in Imperial Age, the Paladin's extra pierce armor makes it better against ranged units in general, taking an extra 15 shots. I still think when it comes to raiding, the Konnik might have an edge though, since even if it's taking fewer arrows overall, the dismounted units actually make for great weak raiders that are more than enough for villagers. As they dismount and are replaced by a new unit, they also leave any control groups that you have, meaning they don't slow down your group. It just makes them irritating and get everywhere in your opponent's economy without needing any micromanagement. And one final aspect I want to address is what happens with conversions. I have looked at this quickly in a video before, but basically if a Konnik is converted without heresy, the unit is stolen completely, including the dismounted version. In terms of its infantry upgrades, they get whatever the Bulgarian player had when you converted their unit. I'd consider monks to actually be a reasonable counter, similar to how they're often used against knights, but in this case giving even more value. On the other hand, if the Bulgarian player has heresy, then their horse dies, but the dismounted Konnik isn't converted and can go on to avenge his horse. So overall, as you may or may not have expected, they're a tough unit to counter. While Pikes and Camels deal with the mounted version, and Pikes handle them cost effectively in terms of gold, arguably those aren't complete counters. Short of either completely overpowering them with Teutonic Knights and Elephants, or just outmassing them with archers, it seems like the best bet on a smaller scale is to combine multiple cavalry and infantry counters, or just to convert them. While some might argue that they're either overpowered or unfair, there's definitely a window to pressure a player who's going straight into Konniks before they get their upgrades. But that's all for this one. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.